Hello everyone, welcome to video 3 in this multi-video series on causal finitism. In this video we discuss Hilbert's hotel as well as the nature of infinity and how that can be applied to reality. So in other words, can infinities be instantiated in reality? If you missed the previous two videos in this series, I would recommend going back to watch those now because the topics do build on each other. Otherwise, let's jump right into this. Could you give a brief description of Hilbert's hotel?
Oh yeah. So Hilbert's Hotel. I don't think much of the Hilbert's Hotel paradox. I think Hilbert's Hotel's fine, so it's gonna be hard for me to do this like dispassionately. I'm gonna have little quips here and there, but um, okay. So suppose you have this hotel, and this hotel has an infinite number of rooms, right? Now here's where things get weird, right? The people that say this is a paradox say, well, suppose the hotel's full. It's like, how can an infinite thing ever be full? Like, to be full is to have like some maximal amount of stuff in it such that you can't put any more, but like it's infinite. So what's the max going to be? Like you tell, I don't know. Anyway, um, suppose the hotel is full. And then what they say is, okay, so you have this infinite hotel that's full. Every room's occupied or whatever. And so let's suppose you have a bus with like 5 people get in and they all want rooms. They're like, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take all the people in the rooms. Let's say there's like a room for one, two, three, four. All the integers have rooms, all infinite integers, right? And so like 5 people want to check in. And so what the hotel person does is just have like room one move to room two move to room three, and so on for 5 spaces to make room for the 5 people. And they go, well, wait a minute, the hotel is full. How are they able to do that, right? And of course, the play on this that David Hilbert was talking about here is that like infinity plus any finite number is still infinity, right? So you can always just take a handful of more people, 100, 1,000, a trillion, whatever, and you can always shove them in to a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, even if there's an infinite number of occupied rooms. You can always just kind of keep doing it, and you won't make infinity bigger or more constrained than it is. And that seems to be like the paradox they're pointing to. Um, but it gets weirder, right? Because you can also take a bus with an infinite amount of people. Like let's suppose you have Hilbert's bus driving to Hilbert's hotel, such that like for every room in the hotel, you have a seat on the bus, and that seat is occupied by a person, just like every room in Hilbert's hotel is occupied by a guest. And Hilbert's hotel pulls up to or Hilbert's bus pulls up to Hilbert's hotel, and all the people in Hilbert's bus get off, and they all want rooms. And the hotel person says, "Well, there's as many of you as there are rooms in our hotel that are already also occupied by guests, but no problem. We'll get you rooms, right? No biggie." Um, and so what they do is they have, the person in room one move to room two, the person in room two move to room four, the person in room three move to room six. They just have all the guests do that, right? And so all the even number of rooms are now unoccupied. What's the point there? The point there is, well, there's the same number of even integers as there are the whole integers. And so now every person that was on Hilbert's bus now gets a room at Hilbert's hotel, even though there are as many people on the bus as there are rooms, and the rooms were already full. And that's where their brains start exploding, and they just go, that is clearly absurd. Like if the hotel was empty, right? Here's their thought process, right? If Hilbert's hotel was empty, and you had Hilbert's bus pull up to Hilbert's hotel, then every person on the bus should just fill up that room, and that's it. But you shouldn't be able to do it again, right? Like being able to fill up the hotel and have another bus full of people that you fill up the hotel with again. It's like, where are they going to stay? They shouldn't have any rooms. But you can do this like, even trick where you move every integer to the evens, and then all the odds now going to be refilled up again. But it gets weirder for them because you can do it a second time. You can do it a third time. You can keep having Hilbert's buses pull and keep doing that trick, and you'll never run out of room, right? And this extension of the absurdity to them of the situation is just the mathematical fact that a countable union of of sets with countably infinite number of elements is still a countable set. So if you have like uh one copy of the integers, two copies of the integers, three copies of the integers, and so you have like the integers number of copies of the integers is still like is still the same size set as the integers, and it's that absurdity about the integers that kind of like makes it work so that you can just like keep pulling Hilbert's buses up to Hilbert's hotel, and everybody always have a place to sleep, and they're just like that can't happen. The hotel's got to be full at some point. It's just like, well, no, why would an infinite thing ever be full? And like the broader, like the most broad mathematical thing that holds all of this together is the property that for an infinite set, that set is always a proper subset of itself, which sounds crazy, but like it's true. And that's the source of all of this. Like the integers are a proper subset of the integers in the sense that like you could map them to the evens and still have room left. You know, you could map all the integers to like the integer multiples of 3, right, and still have room left. And so you could always kind of like make an infinite set a proper subset of itself. The most extreme case of this I can think of, I mean, there are more, but like I have to look them up. The case that really blows people's mind is uncountable sets, right? So like, let's suppose you have all the numbers between 0 and 1. There are as many numbers between 0 and 1 as there are on the entirety of the entire real line, right? And like that really makes people's heads explode. But that's like the most craziest version of this idea that like you could always like take the real line and collapse it into 0, 1. You use an arctan function to do it. You could use other ones, but arctan's the most popular. And that shows you can collapse the reals into like this tiny little interval subset of itself, and there's no issue. And that is the thing that makes this Hilbert Hotel stuff more than anything like absurd to finitists. And now we've got to distinguish between causal finitists and finitists because Proust, actually, one of the reasons Proust started this project is he has no problem with like mathematical infinities. Hilbert's Hotel isn't strange to him or anything like that. Um, and so he wrote Infinity, Causation, and Paradox to kind of like defend Hilbert's Hotel and other mathematical like infinities from the criticisms of people like Craig and Proust. So that's the other reason. A, it solves a lot of paradoxes, and B, causal finitism is meant to be like a moderate position between like the people who are like Hilbert's Hotel can't exist and like the mathematicians that are like, cry about it. It totally exists. Screw you. Um, anyway, so the thing to be said about finitists, and this was actually covered in Joe's video. Joe did like a really good video recently. It was like a 3.5 hour like beast of a video on Hilbert's Hotel, and the big difference is Euclid's property. The idea that the whole must always be greater than the sum of its parts, right? So if you have any whole and you take a part off, you must necessarily be taking off less than the whole itself. And that's the thing that breaks down for infinite sets. Now, when you get to the Kalam, like ignore the Hilbert Hotel stuff, ignore all the like really technical jibber jabber, right? The real issue here is if the past has this kind of like property where it's always a proper subset of itself, that's kind of what fuels the arguments about like, well, how did the present ever get here? Because no matter how long you've taken off out of the past, right? You pick some point in the past, you move, rip that part of the history out of the past. Okay, what's left of the past after you rip out this part of the history? Well, the exact same number of stuff as before because it's infinite. Let's do it again. How much is left? Well, the same number of stuff because it's infinite, right? So if you try to keep like work backwards as to how we got here, the idea is like you'd never get any closer to doing so than when you started. And so like how can you talk about a history? Um, and that's where it's really relevant with the Kalam. So yeah, there's a lot there. I did not have any notes organized for that, but hopefully that was helpful.
Just to like, play devil's advocate or whatever we want to call it here. Imagine my objection to Hilbert's Hotel is, well, okay, fine. Mathematicians can show this funny thing using, weird things about infinities, but that isn't really relevant because I don't think like these types of infinities like manifest themselves in reality. Like what
Exactly.
why should we think that Hilbert's Hotel like shows us something meaningful?
And that's exactly the question. That's exactly the question. So Craig would say that question like is the point. So Hilbert's Hotel is logically possible, but how absurd it is given the everyday experiences that we have with parts and wholes and so on. Um, would lead us to believe that it couldn't like metaphysically like manifest any reality like we could consider ourselves living in or talk about. Like there's no like skin in the game or flesh and blood stuff here that we can play with because it's so odd and so different from our everyday experience that you're screwed. On the other hand, what Proust would say is, would have said, we'll have to talk about a blog post he made later. But when Proust wrote Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, what he would have said is, well, let's not be too hasty with this metaphysical question, right? what he would say is there is this metaphysical sense in which infinities can exist, but what we have to make sure doesn't happen is that these infinities are allowed to work together causally to produce effects. Because one thing that's different from the realm of one thing that's different from the realm of like mathematical abstracta and reality is that reality is moving, it's causal, stuff is always going on, whereas mathematical entities, say whatever you want about them, they're kind of like frozen. Two is two. It's not becoming three. It's not growing into three like a tree or something. And so that's a relevant difference. And so Bruce would just caution that you have to be careful picking up these mathematical objects and trying to put them in our reality that's always causal and stuff's going on, because then you could have infinite stuff causing other stuff. And that, and only that, is where you start getting issues.
So that makes sense. So we're drawing a distinction between like, okay, these things can like we can like say that they exist, but we're not going to say that they exist in the same sense that anything else that has like causal properties exists. And so we can play
Exactly.
these weird games with these quasi or non-existent things that we can't play with things that we interact with.
Exactly. I mean, you could even be like a full-blooded Platonist and say they exist in some Platonic realm, as Proust might be wont to do, and then and just say that they're just facts about Platonic heaven in that things are frozen. Like Plato had this interesting argument in the Euthyphro about how um, like the pure abstract, the pure forms of things are unchanging. They are immutable. And and because these things in Platonic heaven, even if they exist in Platonic heaven, are unchanging and immovable and so on, they're not going to translate very well here in what Plato would call the realm of flux. And so Proust would just advocate kind of keeping them separate unless you have a really good reason to put them together.
I'm trying to see the link between things like Hilbert's Hotel and how it's relevant to the column.
Yeah, well, there's two ways. There's the lazy way and there's the sophisticated way, right? The lazy way is to say, well, here's the type of things infinities would be like if they were actual. Um, what we experience in reality in no way reflects what we would expect to see, if these things were actual. And so, reality as it is just reflective of them not being actual. Is kind of like implicitly like it's like a quasi-inductive argument here, where like if there were these entities all around that had this Euclidean property violation property, I guess. You know, why wouldn't we see them? It's the same type of like Eskimo village argument Craig makes about the Kalam principle, right? Like if you could have things begin to exist without causes, why don't we see like Eskimo villages just popping into being out of nowhere, and tigers in your room and root beer and all the stuff he likes to talk about. Same kind of reasoning, but for these infinite objects. Like if there are some objects with these properties in reality somewhere, we haven't seen them anywhere up until now, so how convenient would it be if it was just the past that had this property? Um, and that's like the lazy argument, which has detractors, of course. Like the
What
Skydive Phil documentary covered like the singularity, right? If the singularity is like infinitely dense or has an infinitely hot temperature or something like that, as the physics models might predict, then there would be a thing, even if the past has a beginning that has like this infinite property that Craig might be worried about. So that's kind of gray. So are you about to say something?
Yeah, sorry. So I was just about to bring up, well, what about things in physics like the like singularity is the
Oh,
universe,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And so then like I'm trying to understand. Okay, so we have this thing, Hilbert's Hotel, that Craig is saying that like basically Hilbert's Hotel is this really absurd idea. Infinities can't like exist in reality. Is that what he's saying?
He's saying he's using Hilbert Total to paint a picture of what infinities would be like if they existed.
Okay.
And the next step is to say something like, well, just look at your experience, right? We don't seem to experience any parts of reality that would be like what we expect them to be like if there were infinities at play here. So where are they? And then if the Coulomb detractor wants to say, well, it's just the past that's like this, Craig's just going to say, well, how convenient that nothing about reality seems to be the way that you'd expect if these infinities were present, except the past, which is like the one crucial thing we're arguing about in the argument. That seems kind of ad hoc and convenient, don't you think? That's kind of like the gist of the argument.
I see. Okay, so then it's more along the lines of Well, why are you giving the past special treatment if nothing else has this like infiniteness in reality?
Exactly.
So then, let's say that we're having this discussion with Craig, and we say, well, what do you think of singularities, right? Um, what is it that like because it does seem like singularities are infinite, at least in density, correct?
Right.
So what is Craig gonna say to this, or like where is the line of thinking going here?
I think Craig. I think has actually made multiple responses to the Skydive Phil thing. I think the first one he did on his own channel, and then Skydive Phil did a follow up, and I think he actually might have done a video response on Cam's channel. And so like I'm gonna risk putting my foot in my mouth speaking for him on this one, given that I think his response is public record, and I haven't seen it. But charitably, Craig is an instrumentalist when it comes to science and scientific models, and I predict that what Craig would say is that
Well, here,
we
I
have
won't make you predict what Craig says. Let's just imagine that we have someone like Craig who's
Oh, sure.
making this
Absolutely.
argument,
That's
right?
better. Yeah. So if we had like a copy of Craig that believed like stuff I know Craig believes, Craig is an instrumentalist with respect to scientific models. And so what he would say is, well, we have this really cool, beautiful, elegant mathematical equation that kind of like seems to describe the way that the universe like expanded. And it could be in the sense of like linear regressions, like we just like curve fit all the data we have about the past. It could be predictive. It could be whatever we use, but we have these equations. And we have this really, really weird property of the equations where we get to like this asymptotic behavior as we try to like model what the universe was like, a long time ago. Um, and so what Craig would say is like, well, I'm not a mathematical realist, so there's nothing like real in the math, and I'm also not like a scientific realist, so I don't even know that the math really describes what happened in the past. I know that it's useful for making predictions now and describing data now, but I can be skeptical about whether we have to take all the entailments of the mathematical model. So in other instances, like here's a really interesting, easy one. Like a lot of physicists model space-time as if it's continuous, right? Like that obviously refutes Craig's point because if space is continuous, it's uncountably infinite. And with calculus and other things, we treat space that way. Um, and we get lots of good predictions and results from that. And Proust actually has to talk about it a lot in Infinity, Causality, and Paradox, Causation and Paradox, at the end of the book, because of how ubiquitous in physics it is. And so you have to give like this kind of alternate explanation about why it works. But Craig would take the same tack there. He would say, well, look, it's really useful for us to model space as if, like it's continuous. But that doesn't commit me to believing really that space is continuous. It's just like a useful fiction to help us make sense of the world. And that's just kind of how he does things.
What is the sophisticated way?
I wrote a paper for Relay Theology about this, and they're still kind of looking at the paper. They've been really busy with things. But I'm really happy with, I think, how this paper's turned out so far. Um, and the sophisticated versions of these arguments um, have actually caused me to say, like, here are some ways I think we should talk about the past to diffuse these arguments. So this first branch of arguments is like really rhetorical, and it just comes down to like how consistent you think the rhetoric is, if you think the rhetoric's compelling, and so on. Um, but the more sophisticated argument is just like, well, here's the past, and like here's what the past must be like, at least if we want to talk about it in historical terms, such that you, like if you want to speak coherently about the past at all, you're gonna have to talk as if, right? And this is where you get like philosophy of language, and this is why like I'm a philosophy of language kind of causal finitist. Like we have to speak about these things as if, and so even if it doesn't get you the kalam, it does kind of get you it does kind of like constrain your speech a little bit to go, oh wow, to deal with these things, like you're kind of right. Maybe I should hedge a little bit in how I talk about this, and that's where I think they're successful. So here's here's a good argument. Um, well, I mean, good's always subjective, right? But like here's an argument I think is interesting. Um, so I got motivated from this by listening to the Thought Adventure podcast when Malpass was on talking to those guys, and the argument is like, okay, well, let's suppose, well, it's basically Craig's counting argument. And this is another argument that comes up really, really, really often. So, like, let's suppose you see a guy sitting on a park bench, right? And he goes, well, -5, -4, -3, -2, -1, 0, all done. And you go, well, what'd you do? And he goes, well, I just finished counting, from negative infinity to 0, right? And and the idea is there's supposed to be like an absurdity there for the same reason Thomson's lamp is kind of absurd, in the sense that like he could have counted only half the negative numbers and finished now, or a third of the negative numbers and finished now, because like you can take large chunks of them off and yet they're still an infinite number. So the question is always like, why do you finish now instead of like 5 minutes later, 2 minutes earlier, or something like that? And Malpass and Morriston have a really interesting paper on this, but I think there's a crucial bit that they're missing in their paper on this. And the issue is like, if there is, okay, let me try. This is going to be a little technical, so I have to be kind of careful how I say it, right? So there's kind of like a debate here in that, what would it mean to count all the negative numbers? And they kind of like ask this question symmetrically to make it a little easier to think about. Like, suppose you're counting up to infinity instead of like from negative infinity to 1, right? So if you just go 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. And there's like a question of, well, if I have counted every negative number, or every number, right, then I have counted all the numbers, right? So if I give you any integer, would you have counted that integer? It's like, yes, well, I've counted all of them. Versus the other position, which is, well, no, to have counted all the integers, like, you'll have to have stopped counting at some point. Like, you have to finish. And Malpass and Morriston say, well, no, you don't have to finish. There's no time at which you've counted everything. But they think it's sufficient to say I've counted all the integers if, given any integer, I can give you a time at which I'll have counted that integer. So let's suppose I'm counting one integer per second, right? When will I have counted 600? Well, I'll have counted it in 10 minutes. 6,000, 100 minutes, so on. Like, I can just give you the time for any integer you give me that I'll have counted all these integers, and that's good enough for them, right? Because to them, counting every integer just means there's no integer that will have been uncounted. Versus the other claim where it's just like, well, no, like there should be a time in which positively you just have counted everything. Now, ordinarily, I think I'd be with them on this. And I think I am with them on this when you're counting up. But oddly enough, I'm actually kind of like with Craig's side of the argument when you're counting from the past, because the past has an interesting property that cannot be symmetrically applied when counting up. And that's this property. Every moment in the past, or every moment in the present, like, is a cumulative total of everything that has come before it. And so you can't look at these numbers like in isolation as things that will be counted to or counted down to or whatever. It's not like -5, -4, -3, -2, or, sorry, count up, -1, -2, -3. It's like your 3 moments in the past. Like, at every moment, I will have counted, given any moment in the past, there's some time at which I will have counted back to that moment. The difference in symmetry between saying there's still an infinite number of moments left uncounted in the past versus in the future is that the infinite moments in the past uncounted have happened, and their cumulative events have produced everything you've counted to. And so there's a sense in which it's kind of like not good enough. And so here's an analogy I give for this, right? So there's an argument I'm borrowing from, oh no, what's his name? South African chap. Interesting name. He wrote a book on the Kalam that Relay Theology recommended. I'm not going to remember his name. I'm sorry. But he has this argument that goes like this, right? Where Bob has been recording his life forever. Right. Bob's been recording his life so long as Bob has existed, and Bob is a god who's existed for eternity, right? Now let's suppose Bob gets bored with living in the present, and so he just like sits down and just like starts watching a recording of his life in reverse, right? And the argument he makes is Bob will never finish watching the video, and so therefore Bob couldn't have recorded everything. Well, I think that's a terrible argument, but I think here's an argument that I make that's a little better. Let's suppose you go to watch a movie in the movie theater, right? Now, this movie theater, it turns out, is part of an infinite like series of films. Like imagine like Star Wars has made like an infinite number of like of entries, and so you go in, you don't know who the characters are. You don't know like where they are, why they're fighting, who's related to who. You're just like watching people on the screen do stuff and you're trying to make sense of it, right? And somebody says, well, okay, well, to understand what's going on in this movie, like really, you're going to have to watch the previous film. You go, okay, cool. So you go watch the previous film and you learn something. You learn like, okay, well, in the previous film, here's such and such's mother from the first film, and this is related to the other guy in the previous film. But all these people on the screen, they're fighting over this place, and they're doing stuff, and they're, going crazy, and blah, 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 blah. Well, why are they doing what they're doing, right? The guy, you're frustrated. You're like, I wanted to watch this movie to learn about the previous movie, right? But, and some things about the previous movie make more sense. But I still don't know what the hell is going on, right? And so the guy next to you says, well, duh, you got to watch the previous movie to understand this movie. You go, whoa, crap. And so you go watch the previous movie, and the same kind of thing keeps happening, right? Some things make more sense about what you've learned in the later two movies, but you still don't fully know why this stuff's going on in the previous movie. Well, there's an infinite number of movies, and so like the question that can rightfully be posed to like the infinite pastists is something like like will you ever fully understand like what's going on with this blasted movie? Now, there are two senses in which you can think about this question, right? Like epistemically, you can always brush this off and say, well, listen, right? Just because we'll never peer back enough to observe the infinite past doesn't tell us much. Like we're epistemically limited, so what? Fair point, right? Fair point. But I think it's more odd than that. Like, I mean, let's suppose there was like a god that could take a god's eye view and peer back like through history, right? Would God, who could keep watching films infinitely far back with no epistemic, would he ever forget what's going on? I don't think so, because no matter how many movies he's watched, right, every set's a proper subset of itself, right? So no matter how many movies God has watched back in the past, he'll be no closer to figuring it out than the first movie he started watching. Like he'll always be in a state of confusion. And why that's relevant is because the past is supposed to model history. It's supposed to model like, here's the state of things going on because here's what happened in the past. And insofar as you've got this tension between like the history you're supposed to be talking about as it relates to the present and this infinite Pandora's box that you're never going to model, you're always going to model some point to the past and be like, good enough. Well, what happened before that? Magic. Literally the infinite number of stuff we can't talk about, so magic happened, and there it is. And so you might think, well, this is a terrible argument for the past being finite. I'm like, I agree, right? Let me preface this really quickly by just saying, like, I don't think this argument is a very good argument for a finite past, which is what it's used for. What I think it's a great argument for is for finite past histories. So let me distinguish between a past and a past history. A past history would be kind of like an arc where each event is causally predicated on previous events until you get to like a first event, right? Here are these places and people. You can start with them, talk about them, and they like produce everything else. Or like here's like the primordial soup that produced all these something like that, right? So I take, and this is part of my philosophy of language view of causal finitism, which differs from Proust's. I think you asked me about that, never got to it. So Proust's view is causal. It's metaphysical. It's like reality can't be like this. My view is philosophy of language, that like we have to be careful how we talk about things. You can't talk about things as if you have these infinitely hanging Pandora's boxes, because it undercuts what we're trying to model with our language in the first place, right? And so my view on this is you can have an infinite past, but you have to subdivide it into finite past histories. And so take the movie theater example again. Now, let's suppose the movie theater is showing an infinite number of movies. There's a movie at like, every hour till the end of time there's a movie. But let's suppose that none of these movies actually causally relate to the other movies. And so like, if you watch a movie, you can figure out beginning to end, here are the characters, here's what happened, got it, we're good. And then you go and look at the previous hour's movie, it just had nothing to do with the movie you just watched. Well, now there's no problem, right? Because it's like, I don't need to watch a previous movie to understand this next one. There's some sense in which the historical events are closed. I don't need to go further back to see what's happened. And yet, there are other events that can form another closed causal system before the previous ones. And then another one, and then another one. So why I think the more sophisticated arguments are good is that they don't diffuse an infinite past, but they do they do give me motivation at least to chop the past up into finite arcs. And so you can have an infinite number of finite arcs as long as they aren't causally dependent. And needing the arcs to be causally independent has to do with like the Grim Reaper paradoxes and all that crazy stuff as well. But that's basically where I think the sophistication gets you.
Alright, so this is an excellent stopping point for this video. We'll get into the Grim Reaper stuff next time.